talk. And George, if you'd like to take it away, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashley. Got it. Excellent. Well, thanks everybody. I've got quite a bit to get through, so I shall make a quick start. Czechoslovak intelligence in the Second World War. The most famous story is Operation Anthropoid. This is a story committed to film several times about how two SOE trained Czechoslovak, one Czech and one Slovak agents in 1942, almost exactly 80 years ago, assassinated Reinhard Heydrich, the acting protector of Bohemia Moravia, the deputy head of the Gestapo, or deputy head of the SS, the head of the Gestapo, and one of the key architects of the final solution. So, you know, if ever a political assassination was justified, and that is a loaded question in itself, but you couldn't argue that he's a likely candidate. So it's a very famous story, a source of great, probably the most prominent story of Czechoslovak's actions in the Second World War, an early achievement for SOE in terms of Special Operations Executive, in terms of its sort of irregular activities in the Second World War. But I came to know about this through this film, Operation Daybreak. So in about 1983, when I was 10, you can do the maths there and work out how old I am. This film was made, I think probably was on its first time on TV. It was in 1975 it was made. And I remember being at my grandfather's house. My grandfather lived near me on the east coast of Lincolnshire. The thing at that age, a young age, all I really knew about my grandfather was that he'd been in the war and that he had a funny accent and he was Czech. So I knew absolutely nothing about his war history. But when this film was on TV, I heard the women of the house having a chat about it, saying there's this film on TV tonight and it's about Grandad's cousin who died in the war. And I didn't get to see anything about the film because I was too young, but my brother saw it and he told me a little bit about it. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, it's a good film. The tone is very good, even though some of the details are not precisely accurate. But it really fired up my interest because this is a massively important, story, hugely prominent story, and it was something to do with my family. So over the years, I read bits and pieces, saw things on TV like documentaries, and then as my grandfather got older and older and never said anything about what he did in the war, despite being prompted on many occasions, I realized that the time to really find out his story was quickly running out. And so I gathered as much information together as I could. And right at the end of his life, I sat down and I asked him some targeted questions to really understand a little bit about his war. And he didn't give away much. He told me about his story. Mainly what he told me was a story about how he and Joseph, who is pictured, his cousin, who is one of the protagonists in the film Operation Daybreak and the more recent film Operation Anthropoid. He was one of the 7 men who died in the aftermath of the Heydrich assassination, 7 parachutists who died in the crypt of the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius. And he told me about how the 2 men had come and made their way out of Czechoslovakia at the start of the war and made their way in a fairly convoluted route, which I'll show you, to France and to England, and how they'd been together in the war. And when I talked to him about what he did in the war, he told me about how he'd spent time as a radio operator communicating with parachute agents, how he trained parachute agents for the missions, and then ultimately how he'd had his own mission right at the end of the war, Operation Foursquare. And all he really said was that was a mission to, right at the end of the war, to kill German section leaders, to instigate an uprising in Bohemia. To encourage the US forces to come in before the Red Army came into Czechoslovakia. And that was all he really told me. But after he died, I continued my research, and he died in 2000. So it's been for the last, on and off, I mean, the book's been out for a few months now. So, over the last 20 years, it took me to research things. So this is the story. This is a potted history of the story, at least. So, unfortunately, with many parallels to the situation today, Czechoslovakia at the 1939 found itself a country which was being dismembered and taken over by hostile forces on the pretext of sort of ethnic rivalries and subversion. So in 1939, well, initially there was the Munich Agreement, very prominent and discussed much recently as well. Czechoslovakia is a relatively new country founded on very good principles of democracy and socialism, was dismembered by the West, by France, by UK, the UK, by Germany. Dismembered, and its key defense, some of its key defensive borders, its borders had been deliberately set after the First World War to be defensible and to make it a viable country. Adolf Hitler, in effect, through the Munich Agreement, stole its key defensive regions on the promise that he would then stop. Of course, he didn't stop, and then in '39 he rolled into the rest of the country and took it over. Edvard Beneš had been forced to stand down. The leader of the president of Czechoslovakia had been forced to stand down at the time of the Munich Agreement, but he took this subsequent overrunning of the whole of his country as the trigger to reclaim his authority. So he went to he was in, at the time he'd been in exile in Chicago in the US, and he left there and returned and made his base in the UK, initially in southeast London. And from there, he gathered many of exiled Czech and Slovak politicians, military forces, including his foreign minister, Jan Masaryk, who was the son of the founder of modern Czechoslovakia, Tomáš Masaryk. So he formed a team together. And then something very fortuitous happened at about this time. Czechoslovakia had developed quite an advanced intelligence network through the leadership of a man called František Moravec. And Moravec had key agents across the area, including disaffected German military intelligence agents from the Abwehr in Germany. One particularly prominent one was an agent named A54, who was sort of old school German military and was not a fan of this new Nazi rabble that was taking over the country and big parts of Europe. So in the late 30s, Moravec had formed a relationship with A54, and he was one of his key agents. So knowing through information from A54 and others that Hitler was about to break the Munich Agreement and take over the rest of Czechoslovakia, he got in touch with Moravec got in touch with Major Harold Gibson of British intelligence, and Gibson arranged for a plane to take Masaryk, his wife and his two daughters, and 7 of his best men to the UK, because they appreciated the huge value of this intelligence. Remember, at this time, Britain was pretty much alone in the war. This was after the fall of France. So it was before the fall of France initially. Sorry, it was 1939. But Britain was still, desperate for any support it could get from other countries. So Masaryk, with a recognition of how high the stakes were, made the very difficult decision that if his men weren't able to bring their families, then neither should he. So he left his wife and his daughters in Prague, and he took 11 of his best men, which is, for me, probably one of the most striking examples of leadership you could imagine. And really, again, an indication, unfortunately, much as the situation we're seeing today, of how high stakes can get when you deal with these sorts of warfare situations. So this arrival at Croydon Airport in March 1939, the arrival of František Moravec and these 11 intelligence agents with all of the files and information they could carry, who were still in radio contact with the underground and the agents through their country, was a massive boost to Beneš's attempts to reclaim authority and sovereignty for Czechoslovakia. So the mission Beneš set himself was to help bring the Allies into the war, to defeat Nazi Germany, and to reclaim Czechoslovakia within its pre-Munich borders. And he had, he wasn't even recognized at this point as the legitimate leader of Czechoslovakia. The government, his government in exile, was the provisional government. So this, looked like an incredibly tall order. But again, it was about, the mission was one that he took to heart, because it was about ensuring that his whole country didn't become slaves for generations to follow, and chattel of the Nazi regime, even if they were to survive. So it was a very challenging order he had, but it was a difficult, but it was an important one to undertake. And the intelligence information and that wireless network into Czechoslovakia was essential to it. Without that, he had nothing. Well, initially he had nothing, but he started here. Benes, Jan Masaryk, and others made broadcasts through the BBC radio to say, if any of you can fight in the war, this was after Czechoslovakia had been overrun, get yourselves to the French army and fight with us, fight with the exiled Czechoslovak army in France. So many men made that journey. Initially, they after the fall of Poland, it became very difficult to get to France. And the route that many of the men took was from Barnov. There is my grandfather's hometown on the Moravian border in what was Czechoslovakia. So many men made the route out through Hungary, through former Yugoslavia to Turkey, and then down into Beirut, where they joined the French Foreign Legion. And then they made their way up to France, to Agde. The reason why I've got Kiel on the map there is my grandfather had initially been put in a labor camp in Kiel. So he absconded from there on forced labor for the Germans, but he absconded from there in Christmas 1939, made his way back to his hometown of Barnov. There's my grandfather on the left, Jaroslav Bublik. He's also on, as I say, seated at the back on the camel here. This is somewhere between the Lebanon, where they were recruited to the French Foreign Legion, and their arrival in the south of France. And the tall man there, sort of in the center of the picture, is his cousin, Josef Bublik. My grandfather there was about 23, 24. I think Josef Bublik was 19 in that picture. So like many other men, they made their way to the south of France. They were brought up to fight in the battle for France when the German Blitzkrieg was on in 1940, actually after Dunkirk, when morale was already pretty low and had collapsed. They fought well, but ultimately they had a forced march all the way from Paris, where they'd been put into battle, back to the south of France, just as the armistice was signed. Now, if they had been caught, obviously at that point, they were seen as subjects of Nazi Germany, so they would have been executed. So they fought their way literally onto boats out of Agde, and then made their way up through the Mediterranean, out through past Gibraltar into the Atlantic, and then up to the Irish Sea, where they landed initially in Liverpool. And I think after the trauma of the battle for France and getting out there, there was probably, it's a handful of thousands of Czechs and Slovaks had found their way to the UK. This is a picture of my grandfather. Again, these are all pictures from his photo album. So as well as the tidbits of stories that he gave me, he did leave behind some paperwork and a photo album, which actually was very well organized and chronologically almost was there as the kind of record of his memories, that he was, even though he was not openly prepared to speak about them. So he's in the center there with his the third from the right standing up. This is a group. Soon after their arrival in Liverpool, the men were put in a base at Cholmondeley Park in Cheshire, in a tented village. And these are a group of men who'd been trained in France as radio signallers, which was a very fateful bit of training for them. My grandfather was a linguist, spoke by the end of his life 7 or 8 different languages. So he was a natural communicator. He'd been trained as part of the Signals Corps in France. And all of these men are signallers, and many of them, virtually all of them, were trained as parachutists through SOE training schools. And as well as my grandfather, there are other notable Czechoslovak parachutists in this picture. The far left, a man called Jaroslav Klemeš from Operation Platinum, the radio operator, who was actually one of the longest living parachutists. And there's many pictures of him, if you go online, of him meeting Václav Havel and others at the end of, when the communist regime had fallen in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. And next to him, the tall man there with his hat sort of slightly at the side, is a man called Čestmír Šikula, again, a radio operator from a famous mission, certainly in Czechoslovakia, called Operation Clay at the end of the war. So the fact that these men had been trained in radio operations was quite fateful for them. So after the early sort of period of the war, when we get into about 1941, obviously Czech pilots played a key role in the Battle of Britain. And this was a source of tension between the provisional Czech government and the UK government. Jan Masaryk, I believe, made the pointed comment to the British as to why they wouldn't recognise Czechoslovakia as the full and legitimate government, because it wasn't as if Czech pilots were provisionally dying in the Battle of Britain. But they, nevertheless, everybody who was fighting on the Allied side had to make a tangible contribution. And Czechoslovakia they still were maintaining their intelligence links with agents on the ground in Czechoslovakia, and Beneš still exerted a strong influence, but they didn't have any boots on the ground and any tangible military successes, and it wasn't going to be possible to get their sort of the core of their army over to mainland Europe anytime soon. So fortuitously at this time, it was about the time that Churchill set his directive for the special operations to be set up to set Europe ablaze using sort of guerrilla tactics and irregular warfare tactics, to work with the home armies to take the battle back to the continent and to, you know, to harass the Nazi regime and what was then Greater Germany on its home soil. And so in April 1941, just to explain this picture here again, this is one from my grandfather's photo album. Right in the center there, the bald man holding the hat, that's Edvard Beneš. This is in UK, probably in Waldingham in Surrey, where they had some of their intelligence operations and communications center at the time. The man standing in the foreground, sort of with his hand in the air, is František Moravec, the head of intelligence. Just behind him, you'll see the guy with the sort of comb back hair is sort of obscured by Moravec, is Major Harold Gibson. And the guy on the far left there in the suit is one of Moravec's key deputies, a man called Emil Strankmüller. So Emil Strankmüller was set the task of combing through these arrivals of Czech forces in the UK. By this point, they'd been moved from their tented village to a more permanent barracks at Moulton Paddocks in Leamington Spa. And so in April 1941, not long after a visit Churchill had visited to inspect the troops and to instill a bit of morale, Strankmüller had been given the offer of the use of SOE training schools and facilities to train parachutists to operate as Czechoslovak forces. So they would still be under Czechoslovak command and ultimate training and oversight, but they would be trained by the SOE. And this is one thing that was in my grandfather's photo album, which tallied with the story that he told me. So he was one of the first half dozen men that Strankmüller rounded up on that initial visit. This is his invite to dine with Edvard Beneš, showing the importance and the criticality of the task that the men had been set. And it had pride of place in his photo album to his dying day. They're dining at Walton Hall, just where Beneš and Churchill had dined only a couple of weeks before. And this is about 3 or 4 weeks after Strankmüller had visited to recruit those first agents. Amongst the other agents that he told me were recruited at that time was Josef Gabčík, who was one of the men recruited for Operation Anthropoid, and another man called Adolf Opálka, who at the time of Anthropoid was the kind of what was one of the sort of ranking officers, and was also one of the 7 men who ultimately died after the Heydrich assassination. So they set about this training for these initial parachute missions. As I say, Operation Anthropoid is the famous one, the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. But at this juncture, the most critical mission was actually a mission called Operation Silver A. And that was led by a man called Bartosz, and it included also a radio operator, Jiří Potocek, and another man, Josef Valčík, all close personal friends of within this tight-knit group of my grandfather. And what their mission was to basically, they had 3 key underground agents in Bohemia, in and around Prague, who were maintaining Moravec's old intelligence network. And in particular, they were keeping up this line into this key agent, A54. But these the 3 men, they were known, the key leaders of this local resistance were known as the 3 Kings. And they were ex-members of the Czechoslovak army, and they'd set up this organization called Defense of the Nation, and they were coordinating the local resistance and maintaining that side of the communications. Unfortunately, as you'd expect from those three men, they had quite a high risk appetite, and they were full of daring do. But eventually, given that, they were caught and uncovered by the Gestapo over time, or I think ultimately they'd lost their radio, and only one of them was left. A man called Václav Moravec was the only one of the three kings who was still active, and he'd gone out of contact because he'd lost his radio. So the mission for Silver A was quite a three-pointed one. It was to be parachuted in and get the radio up and working, to get contacts with the local resistance and start collecting information, and importantly, to find Václav Moravec and to re-establish the contact with A54. Now, to cut a long story short, the mission Silver A, which was dropped at the same time as Anthropoid, Anthropoid went into intelligence gathering mode in the background, while Silver A was the first mission to actually achieve, to actually be initiated and actioned. But to cut a long story short, it was a success. So they did all of those things. They set up their radio in a quarry outside Prague. Valchik took a job as a waiter in a restaurant, and which gave him a perfect cover to gather intelligence and information, and even going so far as to listen in on Gestapo conversations while he lit their cigarettes. He was apparently a very gregarious, fun-loving character, and he suited the world of that sort of intelligence gathering very well. And they finally contacted Moravec, and through a coded message on BBC Radio, they were able to establish their credentials with him, and all of a sudden the line was open. They had a radio working, and all of that vital intelligence information came flooding in, and it was massive boost to Beneš's cause. So that was great, but unfortunately what it did is it encouraged the Czechoslovak intelligence, Moravec, Beneš and others, that this SOE, this sort of parachutist game wasn't that difficult, and it was at least a good chance that they would achieve their objectives. So they started to plan to send other missions. Silver B was another radio mission. Outdistance was a mission to set radio beacons for agents to set radio beacons so that the RAF could bomb the Škoda Works, which was a really key engineering facility, still is, within the Czech Republic, or the Czech part of Czechoslovakia at the time. But it had been turned to the production of Nazi war armaments, even tanks. So it was embarrassing for Beneš and for the whole Czech nation that the Škoda Works was producing these armaments. So anyway, there was these various missions that were planned, and more were planned to be undertaken. Bartosz, who was the commanding officer on the ground and the leader of Silver A, sent back messages to the UK to say to the London Czechs, as they were known, to say, please don't send any more agents. I know our mission has been a success, but if you send more, it's going to be harder and harder for us to protect them with our local contacts, and the whole regime will be the whole kind of, sorry, not regime, but the whole kind of network will be destroyed. But those requests were ignored, and agents continued to be sent because of the pressure that was on the Czechs to do work to have some successes for the war effort. Now, at this point, my grandfather had not been selected for parachute missions, despite being one of the first recruited, and that was because he was of his skills as a radio operator. So he was recognized as one of the best radio operators and was kept to train the radio operators. So this is some pictures from his photo album. The man there's my grandfather in the center of the picture on the left. The man on the standing up above the crowd there with the it looks like he's standing on a step near the carriage at the back, is a man called Ivan Kolarik. He was the radio operator for Operation Outdistance. The other picture here is my grandfather is on the shoulder of a young man here, only 18 at the time, young Slovak, called Oldrich Dvorak, and he was actually the sole member of Operation Steel, which was one of the next 4 missions that were sent. So there was an operation that was sent called Operation Zinc, which was about establishing a intelligence network in Moravia, which is the sort of central portion of Czechoslovakia at the time. There were 2 sabotage missions, Bivouac and Bioscope, sent. And Operation Steel, as I say, was a young Aldrich Dvorak who was sent on his own, single-man mission at the age of 18. And his job was to take a spare radio and spare crystals to Silver A, because they were so busy and conducting so much work that they needed some extra resource, and also to bring himself. So he'd been trained, by the very best to be a radio operator. So he was there to relieve Potocek and to provide some resilience to Silver A, which was their key intelligence network. Here's some more photos from my grandfather's album. And again, this all came to me. I just had the photos, but as I researched it and realized who people were, I understood exactly what my grandfather had been doing. That's him on the left, my grandfather and Aldrich Dvorak, probably in Tame in Oxfordshire, which was where one of the Swiss training schools, where he's instructing him there in signalling operations. And again, on the right, my grandfather is, and the picture on the right is he's on the far right, and Dvorak just next to him with his sort of hat held on with the headphones. Again, going through his final paces. This would have been almost exactly 80 years ago, because Dvorak was dropped in March of 1942. The 2 sabotage missions, Bivouac and Bioscope. This is a photograph of the men there. The 3 in the foreground is Operation Bivouac. The 3 in the background is Operation Bioscope, and the top right, it's a very blurry photocopy of a picture. That's Josef Public, my grandfather's cousin. So by this time, his younger cousin had been recruited in, and he was selected for mission Operation Bioscope. Here are the men. It's Jan Hruby on the left, a Moravian like Josef Public in the center. And so that's Hruby, and that's Bohuslav Kuba, who was the captain of the mission on the far right-hand side. So they were basically dropped to sabotage a railway bridge in two targets, either a railway bridge or a power station. And they were instructed again at SOE training schools, as well as in hand-to-hand combat and all the other skills of an SOE agent. Their particular specialism was sabotage, and they were to put explosive charges into railway bridges or this particular power station in Moravia. Unfortunately, when they were dropped, they realized that their equipment was too bulky for them to be able to get across country without support. So Hruby and Bublik went to Moravia, back to close to where they were actually from, because they knew the local terrain, to try and establish contacts to get sort of a base to conduct their operation. And Kuba went to the network of agents in Prague to ask for help. And so basically, also about this time, Operation Outdistance, the mission to bomb the Skoda works, was conducted and had been a failure. So morale was very low amongst the network of agents in the SOE, and what they all were trying to help each other out to conduct their various missions. But unfortunately, that meant that the compartmentalization that was necessary for this sort of work started to break down, and the men started to understand and get a sense of what Josef Gabčík and Jan Hrubiš of Anthropoid were plotting, which was the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. And all of the men started to get a little bit, those who were aware of it started to get a little bit concerned that if this was to happen, they were having a difficult enough time as it was anyway to stay undetected, but they were concerned that actually if Anthropoid was to be undertaken, that basically it would be impossible for them to stay underground and continue to do work. Nevertheless, Kuba managed to get some of the guys to help him, some of the other agents to help him try and retrieve his equipment, but unfortunately, the equipment was their drop location had been uncovered by the Gestapo. They were unable to retrieve it, and I'd have to check with the book. I think it was the case that Kuba, he certainly died, I think it was that he was arrested and he swallowed his suicide tablet in the police station before he was could be interrogated. So basically, Hruby and Bublik were unable to meet their contacts in Moravia. Their contacts weren't valid and they didn't know what to do. So they returned to Prague, found out this story that their leader was dead, their equipment hadn't been uncovered. The mission to attack the Skoda works had been a disaster. And at this time there were rumblings about Operation Anthropoid as well. Now Bartosz, who was the leader of Silver A and the de facto commander on the ground, called a meeting with key members of the local resistance, with Gabčík of Anthropoid, and with Opalka, who was his kind of number two, the leader of Outdistance. And they challenged Gabčík and said, "We understand, we've worked out what your mission is. You shouldn't carry it out." I think there was a bit of a head-to-head, and Gabčík said, "Well, I've been instructed with this mission. I will carry it out." And through the radio of Silver A, Bartosz sent a message back to Moravec and the UK government saying, "We've uncovered," and this telegram is available. It's quoted in the book, and it's available in the Public Records Office if you want to have a look at it. It basically says, "We've uncovered what the mission is, Anthropoid. We don't advise that it's undertaken. Please call the mission off. And if you are going to assassinate somebody, assassinate Karl Hermann Frank, who was the Sudetenlander and the head of police, or assassinate Emanuel Moravec, who was the sort of minister for propaganda, who was working on the side of the Nazis." So they suggested targets who weren't actually Germans or Nazis, but were Czechs who'd been turned because they viewed that would have less repercussions and might be more achievable. But regardless, I think that the response came back directly to Gabčík, and from that point it was pretty clear that the Operation Anthropoid would be undertaken. And so Bartosz, at this point, with the stress of everything, he had acute rheumatoid arthritis and was laid up in bed in his hideaway near where the radio was being run. And Opalka, in effect, Adolf Opalka of Silver A, took the de facto lead and did his best to help them conduct the mission. So this is where the famous story of Anthropoid comes in. Reinhard Heydrich was doing his daily commute through Prague. They'd staked out the men, that's Kubiš on the left and Gabčík on the right. They'd staked out this corner where Heydrich's chauffeur-driven car had to slow down. It was near a tram stop, which they thought could help them escape easily. And they waited on the corner. At the appointed time, Gabčík stepped out into the road as the car slowed down and revealed his Sten gun that he just assembled, pulled the trigger, and unfortunately it jammed. Now at this point, what Heydrich should have done was asked his chauffeur to accelerate and get away. But with his bravado and his arrogance, he told his chauffeur to stop, and he raised from the car to draw his revolver and shoot Gabčík. And it was this point that Kubiš had flung a hand grenade to the back of the car, a sticky bomb, so-called. It hit the back portion of Heydrich's car and blew up, and bomb fragments and horsehair from the car entered Heydrich's body and ultimately infected his spleen. So he didn't die initially. Kubiš and Gabčík got away, I think one on a tram and one on a bike, chased by Heydrich's chauffeur. But as you can expect, then all hell broke loose. Nazi reprisals and a dragnet, and all of those men, the dozen or so men who were hidden out in the network of safe houses around Prague were being searched for. So I think the first night they didn't initially find any of the men, but gradually, as the house-to-house searches became more and more intrusive, they were being protected by the women of the Czech Red Cross, and in particular, the sort of coordinator for that was yet another Moravec. There's lots of Moravecs in this story. Marie Moravec. She was sort of the figurehead and local kind of coordinator, and in fact, her own son, Atcha, was a courier for the network. and was involved with help, and had actually been involved in helping with Operation Outdistance. So he'd becoming embroiled in all of this. But that safe houses gradually ran out, and they found them a sanctuary in the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius in Prague, in the basement there. So various men were scattered in different places. Some were trying to get away from Prague. One of the men from Operation Outdistance, Karel Čerda, found his way to his mother's farm south of Prague. But actually, seven of the men ended up in the crypt of the church and St. Cyril and Methodius. That was the two assassins, Gabčík and Kubiš, Josef Valčík, the sort of gregarious waiter of Silver A, Adolf Opalka, the leader of Operation Outdistance, Jan Hruby and Josef Bublik of Operation Bioscope, and Jaroslav Svark, who had been parachuted in as part of an operation called Tin, which was actually another assassination mission, which was never carried out, which was to assassinate the minister, Emanuel Moravec, the Minister for Propaganda. So these seven men found themselves in this church crypt as the Nazi reprisals ramped up, including public executions. And then the worst sort of war crime of them all was in their frustration and inability, the village of Lidice, they leveled, they shot all the men, buried them in a mass grave. The women and children were taken to concentration camps where they died. A handful of the children were kept for Germanization. And at this point, the pressure on the men to give themselves up was immense, but they were advised by the local resistance and others that would be futile, and it'd be much better for them to stay alive and to try and get out as part of propaganda and to keep the morale high. Inevitably, what happened was there were two agents, a young agent from Operation Zinc called Willem Gerrick, who was trained by my grandfather, a young radio operator, and who my grandfather said he wrote a report saying he was not recommended. He was too young and inexperienced and naive for duty. He was parachuted in as part of Operation Zinc. The group lost its information on dropping, lost its papers, and it was another disaster. They got split up, and Gerrick made his way to Prague, where he had some addresses of people to contact. All of the addresses were no good. People who had either been killed or put in prison or found out. And so he went to his hotel room in Prague. He figured that as a Slovak, because Slovakia was a relatively benign regime compared to Bohemia and Moravia, if he was to go and turn himself into the Gestapo, they might be lenient with him, which he did. And then subsequently, another man, Čerda, who was hiding out in his mother's farm on his own without the support of his colleagues, cracked under the pressure as well. He also went to the Gestapo in Prague and told them everything. As a result, he didn't know that the men were hiding in the church crypt, but he did know that Marie Moravec was at the center of it. And so the Gestapo went to her house. She asked to be excused to go to the toilet, where she took a cyanide tablet, and her husband and two sons watched her die in front of them, while reportedly Gestapo agents jeered and laughed. Then they took I think one of her sons was shot at that time, and then her husband and her son Atcha, the young guy who'd been helping with the agents, was taken to the Pankráč Palace in Prague, which was where the Gestapo torture chambers were, and they were tortured for a day and a night. Again, another story. I don't know how verifiable it is, but certainly the Nazis at this point were in the habit of decapitating people as part of their humiliation and interrogation tactics. And the story is that Atcha, who was only, I think, 17, finally cracked when they showed him his mum's head floating in a formaldehyde tank. And it was at that point that he betrayed the location of the church crypt. So 800 SS troops were sent to the church crypt in St. Cyril and Methodius. Three men, Josef Bublik, Adolf Opalka, and Jan Kubiš, were sleeping in the choir loft of the church. They battled the troops for several hours before eventually being killed or committing suicide. And this is the very famous story of Anthropoid. There's several films where this has all been depicted well. So that's my grandfather's cousin's body at the end after the siege, Josef Bublik, and that is the arrow there is pointing to Karol Czerda. There, he's identifying the bodies. Fortunately, although he identified many of the men, he was unable to identify Josef Bublik, which meant many of my cousins' family, many of my cousins in Moravia, Barnov, probably wouldn't be alive today if he had been able to identify that man as my grandfather's cousin. So that's the famous story, and that was. And I'm trying to keep to time here because there's a lot to this story, and there's a lot more I won't say today that's actually in the book. But these are the things that I found out, and was part of the basis, both the details of Anthropoid and what had happened to my grandfather's cousin, who he'd gone on an epic journey out of his homeland with to get to the UK in the first place, and the pieces of the story that my grandfather told are much less known around this, other than Anthropoid, and some of the missions around Anthropoid aren't that well known, but actually what happened next. So at this point, my grandfather had been moved from his training duties to work at a place called the VRU, and it had been moved from Aldingham in Surrey to near Leighton Buzzard in Bedfordshire. And it was basically a tin hut with about 20 soldiers there, intelligence specialists or radio mechanics, who, as I say, were there to maintain communications 24/7 with the agents in the field through wireless and telegraphy, Morse code, with various embassies throughout Europe. So this was the Czech government in exile's intelligence centre, and it was in some Nissen huts in a farmer's field in Bedfordshire. This is a photograph from one of my grandfather's colleagues' photo album. The various names of the men you'll see there, and these are photos of them at the time and what it was like. The man was called Miroslav Novak. And so they were there. They were equipped from Bletchley, which was just down the road, with the latest intelligence equipment and communication information. Hugely stressful job. Occasionally they had to go away and get sort of rest and recuperation because of the stress of it. Although there was compartmentalization and they didn't officially know who was who and who was on the other end of the Morse code tapper, they weren't stupid, and it was a small network of men, so they must have worked it out. So that when all of these men died, and in the aftermath of the Heydrich assassination, I think of about 2 or 3 dozen men that were in Prague. Only 2 survived, other than the traitors Gerich and Czerda. So the whole peer group was wiped out. They would have been on the other end of the Morse tapper. They would have known what was going on, and they felt almost intimately connected because they could tell who they were talking to through the rhythms of the tapping and the signature. And if a communication suddenly went dead, it meant something. So they were intimately connected to all this. And in fact, one of the final missions final messages that came back around in the aftermath of the Heydrich assassination, where the kind of clampdown was coming on, was a mission from was a message from Jiří Potocek, the operator for Silver A. So as well as Lidice, the Germans decided to make an example of the town of Ležáky, which was actually close to where Silver A's radio was. And the last message that came back from Potocek, which they decoded, was Ležáky is leveled and I'm the only one left. So one of the first missions after they managed to try, they were trying to recover the network and try and rebuild it. And one of the first missions after that was a mission called Operation Antimony. And that was basically to go and see if Potocek was still alive and to try and find him, to try and resume the intelligence network. What they didn't know was that Potocek was actually dead. He'd wandered around the countryside trying to find some support, and eventually had been shot by a policeman. So there's a flurry of other missions in this period between sort of 1942 to 1944. Operation Clay, as I say, that was a successful mission in Moravia to set up an intelligence network where Čestmír Šikula, who was in the picture I showed earlier, was the radio operator. they were a very successful mission, including one of the things they identified was some launch positions of V2 rockets, which was subsequently bombed by US forces. So hugely valuable intelligence mission that probably needs more publicity. Operation Wolfram was a mission to again try and build an intelligence network in and around Moravia near the Slovakian border. But then as we got towards the end of the war, gradually the position changed and the Second World War was being won, and thoughts turned towards not just taking the battle to the homeland, but actually to regaining control and sovereignty of the country. So through all of Czechoslovakia's efforts, and particularly as a result of the huge impact of Anthropoid and the huge sympathy that came to the Czechoslovaks after the trauma of Lidice and other war crimes and atrocities that were committed, all countries, all of the Allied countries, the US, the UK and Russia, agreed not just that Czechoslovakia should be restored to its pre-Munich borders, but that that Sudetenlanders, as a controversial point, was that the Sudetenlanders should be transplanted back to Germany, because in Beneš's view, they'd proven through their actions that Czechoslovakia could never be a viable country with those people in its borders. So they had the political support to reclaim the country, but the politics was getting very complicated, because in negotiations at the end of the war, it had kind of been accepted that Czechoslovakia was in the Russian Soviet sphere of influence. So much as the US and the UK and other Allied forces, Western forces, wanted Czechoslovakia to be what Beneš wanted it to be, which is a bridge between East and West and a genuinely democratic socialist country, it was clear that they were going to have a difficult time establishing that with the influence that the Soviet Union would have, and also the communist politicians within the country. So this was a very tricky political time. And it was at this time that my grandfather's mission was planned, which was Operation Foursquare. Now, I remember I knew at this time that my grandfather had told me that that the mission went ahead and was a success, and he hadn't told me much more. What I found out from the files was that it was the dropping time was in Pilsen on the 5th of May. For those of you who are students of this time will know that was the day before, on the 4th of May, I think that was the day before the Pilsen uprising. So it tallied completely with his story that they were dropped in to, in effect, instigate the Pilsen uprising. But the story of the book, as you'll read as I've uncovered this journey, because the book covers the politics and the history, the specifics of the operations, but also my journey in trying to uncover this story over 20 years. What I found when the files were declassified, and this is a difficult one to read, was that the files indicated that Operation Foursquare had been cancelled at the last moment. So it was a conundrum. There were other missions undertaken at the time. So there are a flurry of missions undertaken at this time, some of which are recorded as complete and some of which were recorded as cancelled. And they were all led by a man called Jaromír Nechanský. He was the leader of Operation Platinum, the radio operator for whom was Jaroslav Klemeš, again in that early picture with my grandfather. And basically, there were a handful of missions which were there partly to transplant the intelligence network from the UK back onto home soil. So almost to say saved on a plane fare to get these agents and these intelligence operatives back into the country. But they were also they're broadly recognized to encourage the domestic population to rise up and take control of the country, ideally before the Red Army came in. Now, Edvard Beneš had to become embedded with the Red Army, which limited his contact with the rest of his sort of nascent government. But really, what Beneš wanted, from reading his memoirs, was that he really wanted the population to rise up, and ideally the American forces to come into as far as Prague, so that then he could negotiate the mutual withdrawal of Western and Eastern forces and leave himself in power at the center of government. But deals had been done around the highest possible tables of leadership, and it was agreed that the US forces would hold at the Bohemian border and would not come in. Now, as things developed, General Patton approved for for American forces to come in, and they came in as far as Pilsen, and they were heading to Prague. And this all happened at exactly the same time as my grandfather's mission was scheduled. They came in as far as Pilsen, and then under Soviet protests, they left and didn't go any further. So this was a highly political, highly complex environment. On the US side, their input was coordinated by the Office of Strategic Services, which was their version of the SOE and forerunner of the CIA. So again, official file said that Operation Foursquare never happened, but my grandfather told me it did, and this was a real mystery. After the war, my grandfather was initially in the Foreign Office, Czech Foreign Ministry, working for Jan Masaryk. He was moved to the US quarters, US occupied area of Berlin, where he continued to work for the Czechoslovak government. That photograph is with him, with my grandmother and my mum, who was born in Berlin in 1947. Unfortunately, things started to go wrong for the government and for Beneš and for Masaryk, as gradually communist subversion and Soviet subversion happened leading up to the coup in 1948. This is Jan Masaryk, famously in what's known as the Third Defenestration of Prague in 1948, was found dead 3 floors below his bedroom window in the Foreign Ministry. Stories at the time were that he committed suicide. I think most people are pretty clear now, and subsequent police reports indicated that he was thrown from the window. He was one of those, as the son of the founder of Czechoslovakia and Beneš's sort of pro-Beneš loyalist. He was committed to democracy, and that wasn't consistent with the subversion that was happening in Czechoslovakia. Interestingly, this is a document from my grandfather's file. It's one day, I believe, before the communist coup, and it's signed by Jan Masaryk, and it's a promotion for my grandfather. So it appeared to me that he was trying to protect his loyal colleagues. At the time, my grandfather was recalled to work in the Foreign Office from the US occupied area of Berlin. He didn't take that invite, take them up on that invite, given that his boss had just been thrown from a window. He left Berlin with my mum and my grandma in 1948, which is where he spent the rest of his life, in exile. He was, in the early years, he was certainly unable to even think about going back to Czechoslovakia, because the communists and Soviets, basically, he was informed just before he left by a friendly agent that if he returned to Prague, he'd be on a capital charge. This is a photograph from just before that period, and this is a collection. This would have been when my grandfather was in Berlin. This is a collection of those men who were involved in that final flurry of parachute missions, and the man on the far left there is Jaromír Nechanský. So these are the men leading a tribute to their colleagues who had fallen at the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius. This is a brave statement from these men. This was at the time when the battle for Czechoslovakia was still very much in the mix. Parallels here, if you like, with what Nechanský is doing in leading these men who are potential leaders of Czechoslovakia. It's almost like, I guess these days, Zelensky, stating the fact he's still fighting in the Ukraine. And almost inevitably, here is Nechanský at his trial in 1950. He was tried and convicted of colluding with the US forces to overthrow the Czech communist government. Most accounts are that he was killed on trumped up charges. Nevertheless, I think there's a lot of credibility in the charge, because why wouldn't he be working for independence of his country? And in fact, stories and family stories I know at the time indicated that my grandfather was considering going back and helping at that point as well. A bookend, if you like, a final. This is I think I've probably come up to my time. It's not a story that's completely full of doom and gloom. My grandfather lived long enough to see his country become independent again. He was rehabilitated in 1989, I think, and given his full rank of lieutenant colonel. That's just my phone going in the background, just have to ignore that if you can hear it. He was given his full rank of lieutenant colonel, allowed a Czech passport, and even given a pension, which highly amused him. And so towards the end of his life, he did see that the sacrifices that he and his colleagues and his cousin and others had made were were ultimately worthwhile. This is a postcard from 1990 sent to my grandfather. He wanted to go to the commemoration at the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius that year, but because of ill health was unable to go. This is signed by a lot of those parachutists, Klemesh, Shikola, Václav Modrak, who was his colleague from the VRU. And at the bottom there, you can just see a signature, Karol Hubel, who was a member of Operation Foursquare with him. All these men had signed this postcard and sent it back to him. And it was really a kind of recognition, I think, that they'd all shared the fight and also the persecution, and they'd all come round to use this moment as a real chance to celebrate the fact that they had actually achieved what in the end they'd been sought for, which was a democratic, free country. So that's kind of where it was, and I've researched the story. But in the book, you will find out that I came to understand a lot more about Operation Foursquare and what happened at the end. When my grandfather died, I came into contact with his possessions, and I found many things, including this, which is his own personal copy, which I still have. I've actually got it here. No, it's not the same as showing it you for real, but here it is. His own, which I've had translated, his copy of his official mission report for Operation Foursquare. Other things I've found were these are his SOE falsified false papers. There's also a file there from the Public Records Office about the fact that they were part of their equipment was silenced machine guns that they were given. So, I spent 20 years after my grandfather died researching this, finding out about the political context, the stories of these brave men and women who fought for an independent country, and particularly about exactly what my grandfather was involved with and why he had to go into exile for the rest of his life. It's all in the book. It's very readable, and everybody has said that. It's written like a very pacey as a story, and many people I know have read it in 1 or 2 sittings. So it's also very pertinent and very fortuitous, unfortunately, for students of history and how dynamics exist. It's been upsetting for me to watch the things happening in Ukraine and see how much of this is relevant still today, and how much the sort of footprint of these activities is just a mirror of stuff which has happened in previous generations. I've gone quite quickly there. I said a lot, but that's the end. I don't know how people are doing for time, but I'm certainly very happy to take any questions.
Oh my goodness, George, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. And it really kind of brings a greater level of understanding really to that the SOE sphere of influence, because I think we always think the SOE, it's all about France, it's preparing for D-Day, it's very much that kind of lens, and it's so nice to and your research is so thorough, and it gives us that a bit more of a understanding of how wide SOE really did stretch across Europe at the time.
Well, the thing for me was I had these little tidbits, and so I weave in a lot of anecdotes, because a lot of my grandfather's anecdotes were all I had, and they give a sense of his personality, and but I could place them once I understood the political context, once I understood the sort of general map. I was able then to understand his story through things he'd accidentally left behind, whether it was pieces of paper, whether it was documents, whether it was just little anecdotes he'd said, because he was a spy to his dying day, and he would never betray his stories. But it was actually that forced me to understand the political context, and it's exactly that. I mean, Anthropoid is such a famous story, but unfortunately, none of the books I could find, except for 1 or 2, none of the popular books I could find really did justice to the story of. They were just stories of daring do, but why? It would have to be that the stakes were ridiculously high to put people in such extreme circumstances, and when you understand that, and the thing for me was when I understood particularly the murky situation at the end of the Cold War, I understood things my grandfather had said, and everything kind of locked, even though there'll always be some ambiguity there, things locked into place in a way I couldn't then pull them apart again.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And I learned about Operation Anthropoid many years ago. I can't remember, I've got the book on my bookshelf, but the book was called HH.
Yes. So I know that book.
Yeah. Yes. So that's where I learned about the operation. It was exactly that to me. I was like, oh, look at this amazing spy story of these these daring do agents. But when you say that, and when you think about especially what's unfortunately happening in the world today, basing that in that political context and that geostrategic affairs, you can really see the influence SOE had, and it wasn't just, of course it was ensuring that they were destabilizing the Nazi regime, but it was also for sovereignty and for freedom. I think that's a really
absolutely. I mean, and Czechoslovakia had been founded on it was very forward looking as a country. So Masaryk was a feminist. He took his wife's name. It was very unusual at the time. He was pro education for rich and poor, boy and girl. They wanted to form a model country in the heart of Europe. That was what they wanted to, and so my grandfather's generation, they were brought up to that, and they were bought into that, and that's why the fight. That's what drove them across the whole of Europe, fighting in these terrible situations. Much as the stakes in Ukraine are very high today, aren't they? And they're fighting. Ukraine's fighting for more than just the territory of Ukraine at the moment. There's one thing I should say, which is the important point, is that they were trained by the SOE, but they were not SOE. And partly the UK probably wanted, particularly knowing that they might be doing assassination missions, wanted a degree of plausible deniability as well, because political assassination, even if it's a candidate who's as deserving as Reinhard Heydrich certainly is, political assassination is not permitted under the Geneva Convention. So they were, again, it took a long time for some of this information to come out for very good reasons.
It's just fascinating. But and talking about the SOE as well, do you think the SOE supported the Czech agents, say, as much as they supported work in France, work in? Wait a minute, darling. Yeah, I'll do it in a sec, darling. Sorry, my daughter's just asking me questions.
That's fine. It's been a while, hasn't it? We've been on for a long time.
But do you think, because obviously they facilitated it, they supported it with weapons, with equipment, with radios, all of the key things that you need to build that resistance circuit. But do you think the SOE stepped off for sort of operational reasons? Or
I think my understanding is each dynamic between the UK and countries was different. So the Czechs were very jealous of the Poles and the relationship that they had, and the fact that the Poles had come in, that they'd come in for the Poles and not for the Czechs. There was a bit of that tension there. And I think also the Czechs negotiated their own independent use of codes. So there was always, and the book covers this, there was some quite, particularly as the war progressed, there was quite a bit of tension between the UK intelligence services, not so much the SOE, who were a little bit more in the middle, but the broader intelligence services. There was a little bit of tension because they knew that ultimately Beneš knew he had to find some, if Czechoslovakia was to survive, he had to find some relationship with the Soviet Union. And so they needed a degree of autonomy to have communications with both sides. And that was kind of accepted, but at different times it was a bit of an annoyance for the British. So there was certainly tensions with the relationships with the Czechs that weren't there with other home nations, because of their geographic position. Their situation was even more complex than some of the other countries. And unfortunately, there's a lot of criticism leveled at Edvard Beneš for, some people think that he sold out to the Soviet Union. Once that Czechoslovakia was deemed to be in the Soviet sphere of influence, there wasn't really much he could do. He was destined to lose one way or the other.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love the idea of the different dynamics between the countries, especially Britain, who's our island on our own, but we've got so many fingers in lots of different pies. And I think, especially with the intelligence community, I don't think we give enough credence to how impressive the intelligence war was during the Second World War. It's just absolutely fascinating. I mean, some of the operations that you were talking about, there's so many. It's just so phenomenal. And was that hard to research? Was it really difficult were you sent down rabbit holes? Did you find it difficult to get access to stuff? Like, how was it as a historian?
There's a lot more known about these missions as you'd expect in the Czech Republic. So I actually had to get a translator and get some stuff. I had a very good translator who would actually read things for me, and she did so much for me that she started to get quite a good knowledge herself, and she could tell me the bits and the story I was telling. So she was able to tell me the bits that it was worth paying to get translated. So the resources out there, if you look, are fantastic these days. Having said that, the back end, if I was to do another book, I would probably unpack, what I would want to unpack is the story of this man, Jeremy Nachensky. I think he is one of the unsung heroes, tragic heroes of the Second World War. And he could probably, in a parallel universe, he could well have been the democratic leader of Czechoslovakia.
Oh, wow.
And it's because of that he didn't live to tell his tale, but he was obviously a close personal colleague of my grandfather's, because he was his commanding officer for his mission at the end of the war. So,
Amazing.
it's all well. The history is written by the winners, and they weren't the winners. So it's fortuitous for me that my grandfather survived, that I took enough of an interest, although I wish I'd taken more, but I try not to beat myself up too much, that I'd taken enough of an interest to pick up some tidbits, and that I was able then to piece it all together, because otherwise a lot of this would I'm sure have been lost. And I think their stories need reappraising and retelling.
Absolutely.
But it's one thing I've learned is in the world of spies, you don't trust them even if it's written down.
Yes, absolutely. I thought that was very interesting with your grandfather speaking about Foursquare. Oh yes, it was a success. It was fine, and then you find this evidence. So I think that's very interesting to.
Well, the story was that if I'll put it another way, if it had been a success, as he told me, and this was to his grandson on close to his deathbed, and he never told a lie about anything else, as far as I'm aware of. But if he had done that mission, he wouldn't be allowed to say it happened, because his life was under threat, and his family's life was under threat, because it had happened. And I in the end, not to give away too much of a spoiler alert, but I'm pretty convinced that the parachute mission he had kept with him to his dying day was his alibi to be able to prove that the mission didn't happen, when in fact it did.
Oh my goodness, definitely a spy until death. And what was the film? I'm a massive war film connoisseur, so if there's a war film I haven't seen,
Operation Daybreak.
The Operation Daybreak. I haven't seen it, so
that's good. That's really so that's on Channel 5 every now and again. If you've got a TiVo or something to put it on record, it crops up every 6 months on Channel 5. It's 1970. It's very, very good actually. In some ways, I prefer it to the newer Anthropoid film.
Oh yes, the Netflix one.
Yeah, because but then there's a number of Czech films as well. There's an old black and white one. There's actually a TV series in the Czech Republic about the Three Kings, the guys who the underground resistance. It was but that's in Czech. But it's probably on YouTube with subtitles somewhere. But I've actually got a friend who's talking to his colleague at Endemol to see if there's scope for this for people to do something with this. But you never know. I've written it down now anyway, so if it has a life, then that's all good. But
no, it's just wonderful. I think I mean, our fascination, I think we just generally as human beings have this fascination with the Secret War, and especially in the Second World War. I think we have this real fascination with what people did and how they did it, and the subterfuge and the sabotage and the espionage, and unraveling and re-examining those stories to pull out these different narratives, whether it's geostrategic, whether it's political. I mean, there's a gender aspect to it as well, with you talking about that really amazing brave women, and it's so nice to center these different narratives as part of the war story. So it's actually my birthday next month, George, and your book is on my birthday wish list.
Excellent. Okay, excellent.
Thank you. I'm very, very much looking forward to reading it, and it's been such a wonderful talk. If anyone's got any further questions, please pop them in the chat, but if not, just want to say thank you so much, George.
No, thank you.
Really fantastic, and it's so wonderful to have that connection, that familial connection as well. I think it just lends itself so much more passion, so much more realism, that I thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
for our tea time talk. So if there's no further questions, I'll stop recording. Thank you so much.